Sourcing summary. Claims sourced to the Mongol Army DNA, provided in the transcript. Decimal organization: Arban, Jagun, Mingan, Tumen, Chun. Typical unit sizes: 1 Arban, Sham 10 men, 1 Mingan 1,000, 1 Tumen 10,000. Remount averages of roughly 6 horses per rider. The immense pasture requirements for large mounted formations. Figures such as a Tumen needing up to 210,000 acres of pasture cited in the transcript. Core Mongol battlefield doctrines: wave attacks, feigned flight, encirclement, and the prominence of commanders like Temujin, Genghis Khan, Subutai, Jebe, Jelme, and later Kublai Khan as campaign sponsors. Claims that require external primary-secondary sources for precise confirmation. Exact geography and beach profiles of Tsushima as used in this reconstruction. Precise composition and number of ships in any Mongol Korean Chinese invasion fleet. Exact fleet anchorage positions. Name Japanese commanders or units present on Tsushima at the time of invasions. Detailed casualty or shipwreck counts. These are marked below as source required or indefinido where applicable. Speculative reconstructions. The step-by-step ambush layout, timing of landings, camp locations, and specific tactical maneuvers by Japanese defenders in the trap scenario are presented as plausible reconstructions and are explicitly marked plausible reconstruction. Any place where the narrative fills gaps in the historical record with a reasoned tactical model is so indicated. They were the terror of continents, unstoppable on open ground, masters of mobility, feeding empires on the backs of horses that seemed to multiply like a moving forest. And yet, arriving at a small island in the strait between Korea and Japan, that same machine could be funneled, hemmed in, and made vulnerable. At Tsushima, the Mongol Horde did not meet the limitless steppe. They met an island. They walked into a trap. That is the question we will follow. How the strengths that made the Mongols invincible on land could become liabilities on a shore lined with choke points, tides, and local knowledge. Imagine for a moment a Tumen on the march. 10,000 horsemen, organized into neat decimal bands: Arban, Jagun, Mingan, Tumen, each man surrounded by animals: war horses, remounts, pack camels, yaks or oxen where needed, teams of herders. For every mounted warrior, the Mongol system carried not one horse, but a small string of them. Spares to rotate through battle, to replace animals lost to fatigue or wounds. The transcript data puts that average at roughly 6 remounts per rider, a multiplier that turns 10,000 men into not just 10,000 horses, but into a pastoral footprint measured in tens or hundreds of thousands of hectares. This is the physiology of Mongol warfare: mobility made possible by animals, and animals supported by space. Transcript arrived, decimal organization, remount averages, pasture area estimates. Source: transcript. On open plains, that requirement is an asset. Space to graze means space to maneuver. Space to fall back preserves the feigned flight as a workable tactic. Space to encircle gives the hammer and anvil effect its lethal geometry. A command like Subutai or Jebe could choreograph wings that danced, withdrew, and struck with devastating economy. But take the same band of riders, crowd them onto transports, and force them to disembark on narrow beaches, into coves and valleys hemmed by cliffs and tidal flats, and the choreography breaks. The remounts are fewer. Grazing is gone. That mobility becomes compressed into a few hundred meters of sand and scrub. The thing that made them a horde on land can become a target in a trap at sea. Before we lay out the trap hypothesis for Tsushima, we need a concise primer on the Mongol operational DNA that matters most to an amphibious setting. The Mongol decimal system is not decorative. 1 Arban equals roughly 10 men, an intimate, resilient fighting cell. 10 Arbans form a Jagun, 10 Jaguns a Mingan, about 1,000, and 10 Mingans a Tumen, roughly 10,000. Above Tumens, combinations could form armies we might call chun in some contemporary sources, larger composite formations used for theater-wide operations. This structure delivered flexibility. Units could be detached, recombined, or led in concert across a plain. It also prescribed logistic patterns. If you know the number of men, you can extrapolate mounts, remounts, herds, and the pasture they need. Transcript-derived, decimal structure and associated logistic rules. A Tumen's logistical tale is staggering when you translate numbers into landscape. The transcript's modeling estimated pasture needs on the order of hundreds of thousands of acres to sustain a full Tumen and its herd on campaign. Figures like 210,000 acres for a Tumen per month were used as a conceptual benchmark to show scale. Put simply, thousands of horses consume an area comparable to a small country's farmland if they are to be sustained for prolonged campaigning. On the steppe, this footprint is manageable. Grassland stretches to meet demand. On an island, it is not. Transcript-derived pasture example. Visualization recommended. Overlay a Tumen's pasture footprint on an island map to show mismatch. Tactically, Mongol fighting doctrine revolved around mobility, firepower from composite bows, shock delivered by lances, and psychological manipulation. Wave attacks were often iterative, probing volleys, feigned withdrawals to draw enemies out, and then sudden closure by reserves. Encirclement was a preferred end state. Wind the enemy into a pocket he cannot escape. Commanders like Subutai orchestrated these elements into symphonies of motion. But every tactic assumes open space to operate, corridors to withdraw, and the ability to rotate mounts. Remove those elements, and the hammer loses its swing. Transcript-derived tactics. Now translate that DNA onto ships. Crossing the sea imposes hard constraints. Ships limit the number of remounts each rider can bring. Hull space is finite, and live animals at sea are at risk. Drowning, disease, and stress take a toll during transport. The Mongols relied heavily on Korean and Chinese shipbuilding and crews for such expeditions, meaning the fleet was a composite force. Land troops aboard foreign-built transports and war vessels. But no matter how well made the ships, you cannot fit a Tumen's pasture into a string of hulls. Once ashore, horses that survive the transit must be fed, watered, and acclimated. If the landing area offers only narrow beaches or rocky coves, neither grazing nor easy maneuver will be available. Supply chains that once ran across plains become fragile, tied to a handful of anchors and to weather. Note: extent of reliance on Korean-Chinese fleets is generally attested. Precise fleet compositions and ship numbers for the Tsushima crossings are indefinido, or source required. Let us bring Tsushima into the frame. Tsushima sits, in broad terms, in the passage between the Korean peninsula and Kyushu, an island on the routes of medieval maritime traffic. Its strategic importance is obvious, a stepping stone toward Kyushu and to routes that approach the Japanese home island's western shores. For this reconstruction, we emphasize specific features that make an island like Tsushima hospitable to a defensive trap. Narrow landing sites, tidal flats that convert beaches into marshes at high tide, cliffs and valleys that canalize movement, and a limited amount of interior pasture. Any claim about the island's exact beach profiles, channel depths, or historical settlement patterns in the 13th century should be verified against archaeological and primary textual sources. We flag those specifics as source required when used. Geographic specifics, source required or indefinido as necessary. Picture a hypothetical landing on Tsushima. Transports approach at dawn, anchored in a cove that promises shelter. Boats ferry horse and man ashore in a measured rhythm. The first to touch land are often the lighter troops, scouts, archers, detachments meant to secure the beachhead. Heavy lancers and the full complement of remounts come later. The defenders, local samurai and militia, understand their shoreline. They know where the tide cuts a channel, where rocks will strand a ship at low water, and which valleys will trap a column if it tries to push inland. In many island invasion contexts across history, defenders have used local tide tables, narrow beaches, and prepared obstacles to canalize attackers. At Tsushima, these advantages could be decisive. This operational pattern is a plausible reconstruction based on general amphibious principles and historical examples. Plausible reconstruction. Specific Tsushima examples require citation. Source required. Why is canalization lethal to a steppe army? Because steppe success depends on space. Suppose a Mongol force that would normally deploy into 3 sweeping wings instead finds itself forced into a single beachhead half a mile wide. The options for feigned flight vanish. The flanks cannot wheel. Horse lines cannot form into the classic sweeping encirclement. Instead of spreading their weight across a wide front, the attackers must compress their power, presenting dense targets to defenders who know where to aim. Archery loses its long-range advantage when every shot must arc over a crowd of friendly troops. Lance charges are broken against shorelines pinned by cliffs or embankments. The Mongol habitual response, rotate mounts, withdraw in orderly waves, then counterattack with fresher horses, relies on space to stage those rotations. On a narrow shore, fresh mounts cannot replace exhausted ones quickly. Supply wagons cannot pass. The logistic tail shortens to a fragile thread. Analytic translation of Mongol doctrine to amphibious constraints, transcript-based plus logical deduction. Let us construct a probable trap sequence at Tsushima. This sequence is a tactical model designed to show how geography, local defenders, and Mongol operational habits could interact. It is explicitly a plausible reconstruction, not a factual report of recorded maneuvers. Each step will be marked as such. 1. Approach and anchoring. The invasion fleet seeks sheltered coves to offload men and horses. The selection process is constrained by wind, tide, and the need to keep a protected route back to the fleet. Ships anchor at the mouth of a bay, known locally to have a spit or tidal flats that are passable at certain hours, but treacherous at others. Plausible reconstruction, precise anchorage points, source required. 2. Initial landings and beachhead formation. Scouts and mounted archers are landed to secure the perimeter. Because of space constraints, the landed force forms compact camps near the high water line. Packs and some remounts are left on ships or in reserve, reducing the number of usable horses. The victualling chain, oars, small boats moving supplies, and the fleet's quartermasters becomes the lifeline. Plausible reconstruction. 3. Local harassment and night raids. Local defenders, using knowledge of tides and the coastline, execute hit-and-run attacks on parties moving inland or on foraging groups. Ambushes occur in narrow defiles that funnel the Mongols. Low visibility at night compounds confusion. When a column is forced to dismount and fight in wooded, hilly, or narrow terrain, Mongol cavalry tactics suffer greatly. Plausible reconstruction, informed by general medieval shoreline defense tactics. Plausible reconstruction, specific actors and tactics on Tsushima. Source required. 4. Cutting off herds and remounts. If defenders can interpose themselves between beachheads and the island interior, they may isolate the horses and pack animals that have been stabled ashore or corralled on beaches. An army that cannot rotate mounts loses its endurance advantage. Even if only a portion of remounts are cut off, the loss multiplies. Wounded horses cannot be replaced, draft animals cannot haul supplies, and morale collapses faster than numbers alone would suggest. Plausible reconstruction. General logistic principle derives from transcript, remount averages, and pasture dependence. 5. Environmental traps, tides, and weather. The sea is a fickle ally. A rising tide can strand boats that serviced a beach. Channels that were fordable at low water become barriers at high tide. A sudden squall or gale can scatter the fleet, destroy small transports, or prevent resupply for hours or days. Historically, storm losses are documented in Mongol invasions of Japan. In our reconstruction, weather multiplies the effect of a tactical trap by severing the maritime lifeline, preventing evacuation, and amplifying confusion. Treat such connections cautiously. Storms were part of the story, but were rarely the sole cause of disaster. Historical storms associated with Mongol fleet losses, documented in chronicles, contextualize carefully. Attribution of any single storm to an entire defeat is to be avoided. Source required where specifics are cited. 6. The choke and the collapse. Once remounts and supplies are cut, and if defenders have successfully funneled invading troops into a confined killing zone, beach, defile, or narrow plain, the Mongol force must attempt to break out. Without maneuver room, wave attacks lose cohesion. Feigned flight cannot lure anything into an open trap because there is nowhere open to flee to. Reserves, if aboard ships, cannot deploy quickly enough. Panic, disorganization, and increasing casualties lead to rout or a costly withdrawal under fire. Plausible reconstruction. Plausible reconstruction. At each step, logistics is the silent arbiter. Imagine a column of men who must fight, then remount and ride away. But their horses are exhausted, and their spare mounts are on the far side of a tidal flat, where boats cannot reach. Or imagine cavaliers who must fight in broken terrain, because the nearest flat ground is already occupied by 10,000 of their own. No room to accelerate, no room to gain momentum. The Mongol methods presuppose an ability to create and exploit space. Island geography can deny that ability and invert it into a trap. We must be careful not to conflate cinematic narrative with sourced fact. The precise mechanics of an actual 13th century landing at Tsushima are not recorded in full detail in the surviving sources. Chronicles sketch broad outcomes, fleet losses, failed landings, storms, but do not provide sand-by-sand battle plans. Therefore, our reconstruction intentionally models how known Mongol patterns and known island constraints can interact. Where the historical record gives us direct data, decimal organization, remount multipliers, and mechanistic tactics, we use them. Where the record is silent or ambiguous, layouts of specific beaches, numbers of ships, named local commanders, we label the claim as indefinido or mark it, source required. There is also another tactical inversion worth emphasizing: the Mongol feigned flight. On the steppe, feigned flight is effective because the enemy often pursues into open terrain where a prepared reserve wheel can strike. On a narrow island shore, feigned flight becomes a trap to the feigners. A withdrawal across a beach into an estuary with a fast-rising tide can strand the withdrawing force, isolating them from their ships. Likewise, a feigned flight into a wooded valley bounded by cliffs is no longer a luring device, but a trap door. Defenders who understand the local terrain can set the stage to invert the Mongol trickery against itself. Tactical inversion notion. Logical deduction from known Mongol tactics applied to constrained ground. Plausible reconstruction. Let us walk through a more detailed imagined vignette, still a reconstruction, explicitly labeled, to feel the human rhythm of the trap. At first light, the Mongol flotilla swings into a crescent of water off a narrow bay. Crews lash horses down in the dark hulls. The first boats shove off. On the beach, the first riders surge forward under the direction of a local commander. They form a shallow perimeter of spears and archers within sight of their ships. Scouts ride ahead along the coastal ridge to reconnoiter. Meanwhile, the majority of horses remain on the transports, slow to disembark because of surf or because suitable ramps are limited. As the morning wears on, local defenders shadow the invaders, avoiding pitched battle, but making skillful incursions into their foraging parties. A small detachment sent inland to cut a line of communication finds itself bottlenecked by a stream mouth that is passable only at low tide. That possibility was known to locals. The tide turns. Boats that carried supplies are suddenly unable to cross the shallow bar. A messenger arriving on horseback is forced to dismount and leave the animal behind. Word arrives at the beach that the foraging column is pinned. A hurried attempt is made to relieve them, but because the relief column must pass through the same spit, it arrives in disorder. Defenders, prepared at the choke, explode into the confined space with arrow storms and deliberate fires set to underbrush. Horses panic, trampling the shore. Transport boats, crowded and under attack, cannot take everyone. Ships cut anchor to avoid being trapped themselves. The fleet scatters into open water to avoid grounding. By nightfall, the invasion has lost cohesion. Several hundred horses are left onshore or drowned. Supply crates lost. Units fragmented. The next day, a storm, sudden and violent, strikes the scattered fleet, wrecking smaller transports and preventing reassembly. Now the trapped detachments are isolated from seaborne support and are picked off or forced to surrender, their tactical mobility extinguished. Entire vignette. Plausible reconstruction. Occurrence of a storm on that exact sequence and its causal relationship to any historical defeat. Source required. Assuming elements of this scenario reflect historical reality, the key mechanisms of defeat are not simply bravery or the absence thereof. They are structural. They are the mismatch between an army built for an enormous geographic footprint and an amphibious operation that compresses that footprint into points, landing beaches, narrow valleys, and the thin seam of seaborne supply. Where Mongol success depended on feeding horses, rotating mounts, and leveraging broad arc maneuvers, island defense can concentrate effects and sever the threads of mobility. This pattern also explains why storms often loom so large in chronicles. A typhoon can indeed wreak havoc on a fleet. Ships can sink, and coastal logistics can be disrupted. But the storm is a multiplier rather than a sole cause. It is damage multiplied by pre-existing fragility. If a fleet is already scattered because defenders have forced disembarkation into multiple small coves, a storm that might have been weathered by a tight, well-ordered armada becomes a catastrophe. Conversely, a well-managed beachhead with secure interior lines and abundant pasture or pre-arranged local supplies could be far more resilient to weather. The moral: weather matters, but it matters most against a force already suffering from logistical compression. Analytic conclusion, transcript-sourced logistics, plus contextual synthesis, caveat, exact storm accounts tied to particular events should be verified, source required. Another consequence concerns leadership and command and control. Mongol command assumed the ability to coordinate large-scale maneuvers across open ground. On an island, communications are constrained, visibility blocked by topography, messengers delayed by tides, and signals that work across grassland failing in wooded ravines. Units accustomed to responding to a distant standard bearer must now act on local initiative under severe pressure. If local commanders are competent, they can mitigate some compression effects. If not, the compressed space amplifies minor confusions into major ruptures. Again, the point is structural. The Mongol command model is not wrong, but it is mismatched. Analytic observation, based on known Mongol command practices and logical inference about island operations. Plausible reconstruction. We must now address a counter-argument often raised. Surely the Mongols anticipated these vulnerabilities. They were adaptive. They built fleets, learned siegecraft, and allied with Koreans and Chinese for naval expertise. Why then would they be trapped? The answer lies in limits of projection and time. Building a fleet and learning naval operations is not the same as transforming an entire steppe army into an amphibious force overnight. Ships cannot create posture, Foreign crews cannot manufacture local tidal knowledge out of thin air. Furthermore, the logistics of remounts at sea, the mortal risk to live animals during transit, and the bottlenecks of disembarkation are practical problems that persist even for adaptive commanders. In short, adaptation reduces risk, but does not erase the fundamental mismatch between scale and space that islands impose. Contextual synthesis. Transcript-sourced adaptation note. Plus, reasonable inference. Source required for specifics of adaptation steps taken in any particular campaign. What does this mean for the broader strategic picture? If the Tsushima episodes, however they precisely unfolded, demonstrate anything, it is the primacy of logistics and terrain over sheer numbers. A horde that could swallow provinces could be bled dry by an island's pasture deficit, a narrow bay, and a few well-timed attacks by defenders who exploited the environment. The Mongols' eventual decision-making, whether to attempt further naval campaigns, to build more fleets, or to redirect resources elsewhere, reflects a recognition that seaborne projection imposes costs that are not always worth paying, especially when weather and local resistance conspire. Strategic lesson: synthesis grounded in transcript logistics and general historical outcomes. Specific policy choices by Kublai Khan, source required for details. Before we close, a few methodological reminders are important. This reconstruction intentionally blends hard elements from the transcript, the decimal organization, remount principles, pasture estimates, with plausible tactical modeling of amphibious operations and island defense. Every point about precise layout, troop movements on particular beaches of Tsushima, or ship numbers that is not directly attested in primary accounts, has been identified as speculative. Where the historical record offers names and numbers, those should be cited in final production. Where it does not, the model stands as a demonstrative what if, showing why a huge land army can be made vulnerable by islands, visual suggestions to carry the argument on screen. Overlay a Tumen's pasture footprint over a scaled map of Tsushima to show spatial impossibility. Animate decimal units condensing into a narrow beach to create a visceral sense of compression. Show an animated tide line as it cuts off a spit, followed by icons for stranded boats and isolated horse herds. Cut to a stylized diagram of feigned flight inverted into a cul-de-sac to show tactical inversion. These visuals help viewers convert abstract numbers into spatial intuition. Production note: visuals recommended for clarity. Finally, the takeaway. The Mongol Horde was a machine of mobility and scale. Its superiority on land came from numbers organized with economy and fed by vast pastures. But warfare is always an interaction between force and environment. On a small island, the environment can set the terms. Space becomes scarce. Logistics become brittle. Tried and true tactics turn against their practitioners. At Tsushima, then, the Horde could be, and plausibly was, funneled into a trap, not because the Mongols were inferior warriors, but because the theater denied them the conditions of their strength. If this reconstruction speaks to you, if you want to see the maps and the animated troop models that translate these numbers into the trapped formations we described, like and subscribe. We'll get into detailed maps, overlays, and model runs next. Mid-video CTA, light, one-off as instructed. As we reflect, remember the larger lesson of military history. Victory is not simply a matter of how many you have or how hard they fight. It is a function of how well your force fits the world it fights in. Against the boundless steppe, the Mongol Horde needed breadth. Against an island like Tsushima, breadth could be a liability. A force that applied continental logic to an insular problem risked moving into prepared squeeze points, where defenders who knew the land, the tides, and the night could turn mobility into helplessness. We have traced one plausible path from landing to entrapment, highlighting the logistic multipliers, the remount averages, the pasture footprint, the dependence on seaborne supply, that transform the Mongol DNA into vulnerability on shore. Where the Chronicle record provides specifics about storms, fleet losses, and campaign outcomes, those details should be layered into this model with precise citations. Where the record is silent, our scenario remains a carefully reasoned hypothesis. One way the Mongols could have found themselves funneled and defeated. The final image to carry away is one of scale versus space. A horde that could dominate continents finds itself hemmed onto a sliver of beach, its horses jammed together like a herd in winter, its commanders trying to wield sweeping tactics in a place that simply cannot contain them. The trap is not a trick of fortune alone. It is a consequence of operating a system in an environment that neutralizes its defining advantages. If you enjoyed this reconstruction, check the linked sources in the description for the transcript-derived models and for suggested readings on Mongol logistics and the Japanese defenses of the era. Tell us in the comments which Mongol campaign you'd like modeled next, Kiev, Khwarezm, or perhaps a closer look at the shipbuilding logistics behind the invasions. Subscribe for the full map breakdowns and animated troop simulations in our follow-up.